My college situation was getting pretty dire, and dropping out seemed like a looming possibility. That's when I received a text from Grace, a fellow student in my psychology class. She told me about a new medical experiment in town that was offering a handsome reward of $20,000 to volunteers. It was a tempting proposition, and I found myself standing at a crossroads. College was what I aspired to, but my financial situation had taken a hit, and I couldn't continue my education without some financial help. My parents had ceased paying my tuition due to my disappointing academic performance, and it was time to prove them wrong. I replied to Grace, expressing my interest in taking part in the experiment, and I asked her to provide me with the necessary details to sign up. She informed me that she was on her way to the location and kindly offered to pick me up. It seemed almost too good to be true, but my determination to seize this opportunity was unwavering. Upon arriving at the address, I couldn't help but feel a bit puzzled. It didn't resemble a typical hospital or research facility in the slightest. In fact, it had an eerie appearance that sent shivers down my spine. As we approached the entrance, a sense of apprehension crept over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be a setup or that something sinister lay in wait. The door slid open, revealing an interior that was overwhelmingly white and brightly lit. The absence of any other people only heightened my unease, and I hesitantly called out, "Hello." A man in a lab coat suddenly emerged from behind a glass door. I explained our purpose there, and he handed us a stack of forms to complete, mentioning that he'd return in 10 minutes. A lump formed in my throat as I began to comprehend the gravity of my decision. Was I truly about to go through with this? Just then, a woman emerged from another door, locked eyes with me, and declared, "This is the best thing you'll ever do." With that statement, it felt as though my fate had been sealed. I diligently filled out the forms, which curiously included a request for my bank account information. At the very least, I was counting on them honoring their promise of payment. In that moment, the prospect of financial relief overshadowed all other considerations. Desperation propelled me forward. I couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip through my fingers. Grace had ventured off in search of the restroom, and when the man in the lab coat returned, she hadn't yet come back. I expressed my intention to wait for her, but he briskly responded that she had already begun and urged me to follow him. I pointed out that she had left her bag behind, prompting him to snatch it and impatiently insist, "Come on, are you going to do this or not? We don't have all day, you know." The allure of the money weighed heavily on my mind, and I obediently followed him. As we proceeded, I couldn't help but notice the surroundings were encased in glass, preventing me from seeing inside. I couldn't help but wonder about this unusual setup, and I inquired about it. The man explained that the glass was one way, allowing the doctors inside to observe me without my being able to see them. My curiosity was piqued, and I couldn't help but wonder which room Grace was in. As we turned a corner, I thought I heard her voice, filled with panic. My intuition screamed no, but I continued to follow the man, who nonchalantly brushed off my concerns by attributing the distressing sounds to a new lab technician who had injured her hand earlier. Despite the mounting unease, I pressed on, eventually entering a room furnished with couches, beanbags, and soothing music. The atmosphere had an immediate calming effect, and the man encouraged me to take a seat while offering a cup of tea. As I sipped the tea, I inquired about the nature of the experiment. He chuckled and assured me that it was harmless, an investigation into memory storage techniques. He explained that their research aimed to develop a method for preserving memories to later implant them into individuals afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. Whoa, I thought to myself. This is something my grandmother should have done. She did have Alzheimer's. I turned to the man, shaking my head, and said, "But I'm way too young for this, aren't I?" He responded, "Actually, the younger, the better." Then he gestured for me to follow him once again. As we entered the next room, it was filled with machines and wires, resembling a hospital setting. I took a seat, and the man started attaching wires to my head. He explained that these wires would record my brain waves along with the memories. He also mentioned that during my next visit to the lab, they would test my memory again to see if anything had changed. "Wait," I protested. "I thought this was a one-time thing." He just smiled and casually remarked, "For $20,000, you've got to come twice." Didn't you read the fine print? With the wires now attached, I couldn't help but wince as the sensation was rather uncomfortable. It felt like my brain was being compressed. The man proceeded to ask me a series of questions, with the wires recording my brain activity alongside my responses. The first question was, "What was the saddest thing that ever happened to you?" I shared in detail the story of my little sister's tragic car accident, her passing, and how our family had never been the same since. Then he followed up by asking about the happiest moment in my life. Surprisingly, I found myself struggling to come up with an answer. It felt like my memory was drawing a blank. After a moment of reflection, I settled on the day Madison asked me to be his girlfriend last year. The questions continued, spanning various random topics, and before I knew it, I started feeling increasingly unwell. My head began to feel fuzzy, and I couldn't recall anything clearly. It was as though my thoughts were slipping away. I must have drifted off, because I woke up on a sofa in the comfortable room. The man stood before me, letting me know that I could head home now, and that I should return in a month for the second part of the experiment. What about the money? I inquired, curious about the payment for my participation. He mentioned they'd deposit the first half into my account by the end of the week. As he opened the door, I took it as my cue to leave. Stepping out, I immediately tried to call Grace, but she didn't pick up, and her car was nowhere in sight. I couldn't fathom how she could just abandon me like that. Walking away from the lab, I only managed about 50 yards before I had to stop. An overwhelming sense of disorientation washed over me. Leaning against a nearby wall, I slid to the ground, clutching my head. I took a headache pill, hoping it would alleviate the pain, but it persisted and even intensified. Somehow, I eventually made it home. That night, I fell asleep early, and when I woke up the next day, I found a series of missed calls from Grace. Upon arriving at the college later that morning, I spotted her in the quad engaged in a conversation with Madison. I had no idea she had a boyfriend. Watching her flirt with him, I approached her directly and demanded an explanation for her abrupt abandonment the previous day. She claimed she wasn't feeling well and had rushed home. After saying goodbye to Madison, she asked if we could talk privately. I wasn't keen on talking with her. Anger coursed through me, and I contemplated confronting her physically. However, I needed to know if she had received the money. She assured me she hadn't yet, but mentioned it was on its way. Then she shared that she'd been feeling emotionally overwhelmed since the previous day. I told her about the intense sickness I'd experienced, and that's when she started crying. Grace revealed that she missed her sister tremendously and that life felt unbearably somber without her. Her words stirred empathy within me. I couldn't fathom the pain of losing a sibling, as I was an only child and had never experienced such a loss. But then, a message from my mom interrupted our conversation, asking if I could pick up flowers for Claire's grave on my way home. The name Claire didn't ring a bell in my hazy memory, leaving me bewildered as I fixated on the ticking clock. If I didn't come up with my tuition money by the end of the month, my college dreams were going to crumble. That day in class, I suddenly fainted. Fortunately, Grace was present. She's the one who brought me a glass of water. When I regained consciousness, she expressed concerns about the experiment and suggested we return to the lab to voice our feelings. Back at the facility, everything seemed identical to the previous day, except this time, the doors remained unresponsive when we pressed the button. We sat there for a while, growing increasingly anxious. Eventually, a man emerged from a side door, engrossed in a phone conversation and puffing on a cigarette. Capitalizing on his distraction, we seized the opportunity to sneak in. Inside, it felt like we had entered a labyrinth made of glass, and panic began to creep over me, knowing that we were likely under surveillance. Then, I overheard voices. "Look, man, I don't know what happened. The memories aren't in the database. I screwed up, man." These words sent shivers down my spine. As if things weren't already strange enough, someone chimed in, saying, "Oh, crap, look who it is." To my surprise, the same man I had encountered the previous day emerged through a door and inquired about our purpose. I explained how I had fainted, experiencing an excruciating headache, and how I suspected their experiment was the cause. I also demanded the money they had promised to pay. In response, he inquired how we had gained access to the premises and accused us of trespassing, threatening to call the police if we didn't leave immediately. I was taken aback. Summoning my resolve, I informed him that we would involve the police if he didn't compensate us as agreed. Regret began to gnaw at me, and I questioned the wisdom of ever participating in this ill-conceived experiment. Grace and I exited, warning that we would indeed contact the authorities if our payment wasn't received by the week's end. However, the situation deteriorated further. The headaches became unbearable, and I returned home without purchasing the flowers my mom had requested. She was understandably upset, scolding me in the car. She emphasized that it was wrong for me to forget about my sister like this. Bewildered, I expressed my confusion, stating that I had never had a sister. My mom's frustration reached its peak as she berated me for my perceived selfishness. She abruptly ordered me to exit the car and declared that she would visit the cemetery alone to buy some tulips. As I stepped out of the vehicle, the familiar headache resurfaced. I sent a text message to Grace, explaining that I wasn't feeling well. In response, she suggested we meet at the coffee shop near the park in an hour. The rain began to fall, and Grace had yet to arrive at the coffee shop when the appointed time came, so I decided to call her. She informed me that she was already at the cemetery, prompting me to head there immediately. As I made my way to the graveyard, I spotted my mom driving past me. She briefly rolled down her window, stating that she would see me at home before driving away. Upon reaching the cemetery, I found Grace seated beside a grave adorned with beautiful tulips, reminiscent of the ones my mom used to keep at home. Curiously, Grace revealed that this grave belonged to her sister. Perplexed, I glanced at the name on the tombstone and pointed out that it bore my last name, not hers. She admitted that the discrepancy had confused her as well. In the midst of our conversation, my phone rang, and Madison's voice came through the line. He informed me that Grace had been incessantly texting him, pretending to be his girlfriend. I retorted that she was his girlfriend and promptly ended the call. The entire situation was becoming overwhelming. Suddenly, I recalled my mom mentioning the name Claire that morning, and I noticed the same name on the grave, Claire. The headache intensified, and I feared I might pass out. I confided in Grace, explaining that I couldn't handle it any longer. Something was seriously amiss, and I expressed my reluctance to continue our conversation. Returning home, my mom informed me that she had spotted a young girl visiting Claire's grave, but she couldn't recognize her. It was then that I observed family photos in the hallway, featuring images of myself, my mom, my dad, and another girl. Was that girl Claire? Why couldn't I remember her? Suddenly, it all came rushing back to me. The man in the lab coat had mentioned storing and implanting memories. What if, by some terrible accident, my memories had been implanted into Grace's mind? My phone rang, and I picked it up to hear Grace's hysterical voice. She claimed she had never had a sister, that her mother was concerned about her, and that Madison had called, insisting he was my boyfriend, not hers. It hit me like a ton of bricks. The medical experiment had gone terribly wrong. Without hesitation, I immediately dialed the police, providing them with the lab's address and explaining my suspicion that illegal activities were taking place there. An hour later, 2 police officers showed up at my door, informing me that the lab I had mentioned had burned down, and there was no record of it in their database. I wanted to scream in frustration. They had completely deceived us. I recounted the entire experiment to the officers, who were visibly horrified, assuring me that such a situation was far from acceptable. Both Grace and I were taken to the police station to provide detailed accounts of what had transpired. It turned out that Grace hadn't been asked any questions about memories during her session. Instead, she had been subjected to a painful procedure that left her head feeling different. She remained steadfast in her belief that she had a sister named Claire who had tragically passed away. That's when I had to clarify that this was my memory, implanted somehow into her consciousness. It felt like a storyline from a sci-fi horror tale, yet this was my unsettling reality. The police continued their investigation, and I could only hope they would apprehend those responsible soon. The most agonizing part of this ordeal wasn't the loss of the promised money. It was the theft of my memories. I couldn't recollect my sister, and it seemed as if they had taken my memories and grafted them into Grace's mind. It must have been equally distressing for her to carry a fabricated memory, tormenting her from within. Madison, as it turned out, had always been my boyfriend, and Grace had begun to understand the bizarre situation. Our lives had been irrevocably altered, and the whole ordeal was beyond messed up. I feared I'd have to contend with the lingering headaches and dreaded any other potential side effects. How could I have allowed myself to be so foolish?